Hey, what's going on guys? Legendary Ocelot here, and today, I'm here for another video. Today, I'm going to be covering why the PlayStation Vita is the best budget gaming handheld in 2023. If you are a long-time viewer, you may remember that I made a similar video on the PlayStation 3, which if you haven't seen already, I'd recommend watching, as that is the ultimate home console companion to the Vita. This video is also the first in a sister series to PS3 at 3 AM I'm making called Vita Means Life. Let's get started on the video. The Vita came out in 2011 in Japan and 2012 everywhere else, which makes the system not even that old, being barely over a decade old as of this video. The system is definitely a modern interpretation of the PlayStation Portable, which was in itself a great handheld. The only reason I don't recommend it nowadays being Vita isn't that much more expensive, and that can play digital PSP games. The PS Vita, especially since when it came out, due to smartphones blowing up, not quite literally yet but we'll get there, combine traditional handheld game console features with smartphone features, like a touchscreen, apps common on smartphones of the time, and even on some models like the one I have here, a slot for 3G SIM cards for cellular connection, although that feature has pretty much went the way of the dodo. The model I have here is the aforementioned 3G model, which you shouldn't expect to find too much in the wild since the vast majority of Fat Vitas are the standard Wi-Fi only models. There isn't a noteworthy difference nowadays though, unless you choose to install custom firmware on the handheld, which unlocks the ability to put a microSD adapter in the 3G slot in order to not have to deal with the proprietary memory cards. There are two different models of Vita, the PCH 1000 series being the fat models, like the one I have here, and the PCH 2000 series, also known as the Slim Vitas. The 2000 model has several improvements, like an extra hour of battery life, being 4 to 6 hours instead of 3 to 5 hours on the fat models, and also using micro USB instead of Sony's proprietary connectors to charge the Vita and connecting it to a PC, meaning if you lose the cord, you don't have to buy a new one and can just reuse an old smartphone cord. However, the 1000 series of Vitas have one thing that makes them better than the 2000 series, being an OLED screen, compared to the regular LCD screen on the 2000 series. The LCD on the 2000s still look good, but the OLED on the 1000s looks just plain gorgeous. And in a way this YouTube video can't really show, but you will see immediately in person. When black needs to be shown, the screen can actually turn specific pixels completely off, compared to being on, but with no color, in turn giving true blacks on the OLED screen. The colors also just pop in general on the OLED model. My only real complaint about the OLED panel is that in very dark scenarios, you could see black ink splotches on the screen, which OLED screens are like that from the factory. However, to get this effect, you need to be both in a very dark room, as well as the screen being basically completely black, so the effect is rare. The Slim model also comes with 1 GB of storage built in, but as soon as you put a memory card in the system, that storage goes away anyways, so its only real use is to at least let you save your games until you get a hold of a memory card. When finding a Vita to purchase, you can't buy them new anymore, but on used marketplaces like eBay, you can find either model of Vita for usually between $120 and $170, depending on condition, but I've seen systems on their own for as cheap as $100 before if you look for long enough. Since the Vita is a handheld game console, there is only one real accessory for the system, being memory cards. There are some feelings about the Vita that you can't feel anymore since it's no longer current gen, but one feeling you could still feel nowadays is the mixture of anger and depression that is buying a PlayStation Vita memory card. Seriously though, these tiny sticks of grape-flavored memory burn holes through any buyer's wallet, and is yet another reason why you should install custom firmware on your Vita. Since, if you do that, you can buy microSD card adapters for your game cartridge slot for dirt cheap, and buy a microSD card of whatever size you want, and get it all for somewhere between $15 and $40, instead of $25 for a 16 GB card, which is basically the minimum in 2023 if you want a couple digital games, to $100 for a 64 GB card, which is simply ridiculous. However, if you don't want to install custom firmware, then 16GB is good for a start, without being overly expensive like the 32GB and 64GB cards. If you aren't against installing custom firmware on your Vita, then buy the game slot microSD card adapter, which I'll link a good one in the description, and buy any microSD card you want, although a good sweet spot for most people would be 128GB. Basically, to calculate how big of a microSD card you want, think of how many games you want on the system. Then add the average file sizes together, being 3GB for each Vita game, 1.5GB for each PSP game, and 500MB for each PS1 game. Those are the file sizes for an average high-end game on each platform that the Vita natively supports. And since most likely you'll want some indie games in there as well, assuming all games are AAA will in turn give you a decent buffer for the future as well. The main reason why I would recommend buying a PlayStation Vita is because of the fact that if you don't mind being stuck with older games, it can be a good substitute for a Steam Deck or Nintendo Switch. And as well as this, it is a handheld game console that can actually fit in your pocket, which was, contrary to popular belief, the original point of handheld game consoles, before they grew into the size of the British Empire in the late 1800s. Okay, maybe not quite that big, but still pretty large compared to the original intended size, which the PlayStation Vita stays relatively faithful to. Admittedly, the console did lose most AAA support within a year of the console's launch, but both indie developers and Japanese developers picked up the slack, and kept the system alive for many years, and even technically nowadays if you count homebrew games made by hobbyists. Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves a nerd-off between the PlayStation Vita and the PlayStation 3. Anyways, when the Vita was released, fans were hoping for PlayStation 3 level graphics on the handheld, but in reality, we got somewhere between PlayStation 2 and 3 levels of graphical fidelity, which still looks good on the 5-inch screen, especially the OLED panel. I honestly would, however, watch reviews on any game with realistic graphics on the Vita first, though, kinda like the Nintendo Switch, because although some realistic games work great on the Vita, some are known for performance issues. However, games with an art style usually run great on the Vita, which is the majority of the library, because for some reason, everyone who owns a Vita also happens to be a Persona fan. The Vita's main menu screens are intuitive and pretty easy to navigate, alongside probably the only decent PlayStation menu music, rivaling the Wii's menu music even. As previously mentioned in the video, the PlayStation Vita also has a great custom firmware scene, which basically means installing firmware different from what it originally comes with, to allow things originally not allowed by the original firmware. The top thing being using microSD adapters instead of using overpriced memory cards, but also being able to install fan-made games and patches, as well as installing plugins to improve quality of life, for example, plugins to show the exact battery percentage, disown your family, use custom themes made by fans, running emulators, including native PSP gameplay using Adrenaline, and streaming your Vita screen directly to your computer for capture. About the only con of custom firmware outside requiring some computer knowledge to set up is losing the ability to play online or get on PlayStation Network without the potential risk of getting banned. However, not many people play online on the platform anymore, so this is only really a minor con at worst. So if you're comfortable doing so, go release your inner Neo and go install custom firmware on your Vita. Now here's the most important part of this video, of course, the games. If you couldn't tell already, this handheld, at least past the first year of mainstream support, became the definite system for Eastern titles. So if you aren't a fan of those kind of games, your choices here are going to be somewhat slim. However, if you are a fan of more niche games, then the Vita's library will be seemingly endless for you. Here are 10 games that are a mixture of popular choices, as well as hidden gems, a category this handheld is great in. The first game will be Need for Speed Most Wanted 2012. Normally, this wouldn't be my favorite Need for Speed game, especially if the original 2005 Most Wanted being a thing. However, the fact that the entire game made it to the Vita with only a slight graphics downgrade makes this a definite recommendation for the handheld, where you climb the Most Wanted and race through the entirety of Fairhaven City, finding all the exotic cars you'll ever want to drive, while in the passenger seat of a more boring car someone else is driving. If only we got the Most Wanted 2 beta on Vita, though. That would truly be sick. The second game on the list, you may remember from my PS3 video, being Disgaea 4: A Promise Revisited. But the PlayStation Vita version is just as good as the PS3 version. This game is an excellent strategy RPG, which was originally on the PS3, but they ported the game to PS Vita, alongside all the DLC that released for the PS3 version, so there is actually extra content compared to the original. I know there is a Switch version nowadays, but we are here for pocketable strategy, not Joy-Con drift and DMCAs. The third game on this list today is Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight takes definite inspiration from the original platformer classics on the NES, like Super Mario Bros. 3, Mega Man 2, and especially Castlevania. There are 8 different knights you can battle, with platforming to help you remember your childhood, which was probably not as amazing as you remember, but Shovel Knight has all the good from the 80s, but also a lot of the things we are used to now, so it captures the essence without bringing out the downfalls. Overall, great classic platformer. The fourth game is another from the PS3 video, but it's even more impressive on here, being Minecraft. Now admittedly, the render distance on the Vita version is pretty poor, so gameplay in creative mode isn't ideal. However, if you mostly stick to survival mode, the gameplay is still great, with surprisingly little amounts of lag, and the colorful pixelated graphics completely pop on the Vita screen. The fifth game is BlazBlue ChronoPhantasma Extend. This game is basically the definitive title in the BlazBlue series of fighting games. And despite that franchise not being in the top 3 definitive fighting game franchises, it's still incredibly fun on the handheld. If you want to sweat this game and need a full-on controller, there are PS3 and PS4 versions of the game as well, but the Vita lets you take this underrated game anywhere you want, with literally no sacrifices on the game compared to the home console versions. The sixth game on this list is Lumines Electronic Symphony. This game is literally Tetris, but on steroids, as there are many different things going on to make this more than just a regular Tetris clone. There are many different features in the game, like a block that clears all nearby blocks of the same color that hits, and the art style of the blocks change as you play, giving the game a very unique experience that you have to play to truly see. The seventh game on this list is more of a silly game than anything, but is actually a surprisingly fun arcade 2D shooter, being Shutshimi. You play as a fish with ripped human arms and a gun, shooting all the fish you could think of in the sea, and killing bosses like a submarine and a water drake. There are also a bunch of items that give you random effects in order to mix up the gameplay, almost adding a level of strategy to it. Overall, a surprisingly fun and simple game. The eighth game is Hatsune Miku Project Diva F2nd. You may think that the PS3 was a good platform for this game, but the PlayStation Vita is basically perfect for this type of game, as the touchscreen is now used for star notes instead of the joysticks. I know that is an unpopular opinion, but the touchscreen for star notes just adds another layer of fun to the game, as you have to move your fingers to the screen as well, not just to the joysticks. This game also has a song selection that's different from the original game, which is also available for both PS3 and PS Vita. The ninth game on this list is Gravity Rush. This game was probably one of the most unique video games I've ever played, period. It is technically a 3D platforming game, but there is also a mechanic where you disable gravity and glide towards another platform, and then re-enabling gravity to fall on the said platform, and you have to do it right or you'll fall into the abyss. Overall, an offbeat but great 3D platforming game. The final game on this list is Killzone Mercenary. All of you were probably expecting me to put this on the list, but the graphical fidelity of the game really impresses me, even to this day, with advanced lighting effects and shading that actually makes this game rival top-end PS3 titles. I know this was a launch game for the Vita, when Sony themselves actually cared about the handheld, but I was completely shocked when I first played this game in person. Combined with the gunplay being fun, and I could see why critics gave this game absolute praise when it released alongside the Vita itself. One last thing I want to mention are import games. Especially of how well the system did in Japan compared to in the US, there is a lot of import games worth considering, and one quick Google search will lead to tons of games worth playing. Overall, I find the PlayStation Vita to be the best gaming handheld if you're on somewhat of a budget, as it could still play new-ish games, and if you install custom firmware on it, play pretty much any retro game you can think of. See you in the next one.